I thought I'd like to do a few both personal stories, because if you haven't just lived for yourself, by the time you get to 75, you've had a lot of experiences, and I wanted to kind of record some of those experiences and what they've taught me. A little bit of short storytelling. Let me start with something that's reasonably contemporary. I guess most of us have been to see either the live production or one of the movies from the great novel written by possibly the greatest romantic era novelist from France, Victor Hugo. His great novel, Les Misérables. Now, if you're French, I'm sorry if I didn't say it quite right. But I understand that word in the French really, in English we'd say the miserable people. It's really, the disenfranchised, the marginalised, the poor. Now that movie, at least in my country, received tremendous accolades. Of course, live productions often get more attention than films. I think I must have seen something like 5 different movies on that story. But it first started for me, strangely enough, when I was about 10 years of age. My father was a minister of religion and a great reader and had a very extensive library, and although he was a profoundly committed Christian, he really had a very broad love of knowledge about all things. I mean, we'd sit around the table and he would talk about whether it would be possible for some form of life to exist on a planet somewhere in the cosmos where oxygen wasn't the primary gas, but and where, in fact, the carbon molecule was not the major molecule for life. And I remember listening to some of this weird stuff from him when I was a young teenager. And then when I was doing a PhD many years later, picking up one of those professional scientific journals and seeing this very argument in about the year 2000, and my dad had been talking this stuff, I guess, in the late 1950s. So I had a very broad experience of reading, and Dad used to challenge my little ego a bit. And one day he gave me a massive big book. It was the unabridged English translation of that great romantic novel, Les Misérables. Now, at 10 years of age, I was a lonely kid. I didn't find out till well on in late adult years that I was an attention deficit hyperactive kid. They didn't know about that in school in those days. But strangely enough, my difficulty in concentrating in class and my wandering mind and so on served a strange purpose, and it made me fascinated by all sorts of different bits and pieces, flotsam and jetsam of ideas, from everything from the cosmos to looking at human love and relationships. So when Dad gave me this massive big, I think it was over 1,000 pages in the English translation. When Dad passed me this, and sort of with a bit of a grin on his face, said, "This'll be a bit beyond you, but it's a great book, son." My little ego kind of leapt to the challenge. And in some ways, in childhood, which for me many years were spent in illness, almost 2 whole years in hospital, just at the stage of shifting out of that teen period into the teenage period, books almost became my friends. Apart from my little pet dog, really, books kind of came alive to me. So I was determined to read this book that Dad had given to me. And that book, I think, if you're an atheist, forgive me for this, but I think under the loving promotion of God, that book was to shape my life. Two things shaped it. Most of you will know the story, so I won't go into it in detail, except to say that Jean Valjean is the hero, and he is unjustly sent for many years into hard labour because he simply stole a loaf of bread for his dear sister's starving children. It's a very complex story. But because he fails to make some report or other that he should have made, he ends up pursued by a very nasty cop called Javert, and he is a senior officer amongst the gendarmes of the French police force. He makes it almost his passion in life to pursue this poor man, Jean Valjean, and to get him put back into hard labour again. And so Jean Valjean becomes a fugitive, and this man is his nemesis that pursues him everywhere. But Jean Valjean's life becomes transformed. One night he's desperate and he knocks on the door of a French priest. I mean, these days we often think of priests in terms of abuse of children and so on, but down through history, overall, ministers and priests have been at the forefront of compassion and care for marginalised people. And so it is that when Jean Valjean brings this dear bishop to the door of his rectory, this dear old man takes one look at this dishevelled, grubby-looking, desperate, wild-looking, unshaven man, and he immediately sees here is a man in trouble. He takes him in. He doesn't just put him out in a shed somewhere. He gives him a beautiful bed, and this fleeing criminal ends up sleeping in beautiful, freshly washed, clean sheets and a comfortable bed he's never known in his life before. And during the night, he's torn apart as to whether he should grab some of the silverware, because, you know, in this rectory there's some beautiful silverware, probably a gift from parishioners to the bishop, and silver candlesticks and silverware to eat with at the table. And he lies in bed thinking about the silverware he held in his hands when he was invited to sit at the table and to eat with the bishop. And in the end, the temptation beats him. He can feel the goodness of this man, but in his desperation, he steals some of the silverware, puts it in his carrying sack, and flees. Unfortunately, the police find him, and they bring him back to the rectory. And the old bishop is sharp. He knows what's going on here. And as Jean Valjean is dragged roughly to the door, and as the gendarmes say to the bishop, is this silverware yours, your grace? It's got your signature on it. And he says, yes, it is. But then he can see what's going to happen to this man. And in a desperate concern to give this guy a break, he ignores the gendarmes and said, oh, Jean, you forgot the candlesticks. And he grabs the candlesticks, the silver candlesticks, and gives them to him. And this totally confuses the gendarmes, and they say, are you telling me that he did not steal this, Your Grace, you know? And out of that moment, Jean Valjean is transformed. Now, I was only a kid, but somehow that story stuck in me. And now, you know, more than 50 years later, more than half a century later, I look back and I think of the many people I've seen whose lives were being destroyed, who were criminal because they'd been abused themselves, because they were homeless and desperate, or people at the top of the town that have been rich and selfish, but who, through meeting that Christ-like love and forgiveness and grace, have been transformed. I'm not going to go on. It'd pay you to buy the book. I've watched all these films and seen at least two live productions, and quite frankly, they didn't live up to what in my childhood days was the imagination that I read in the brilliant writing of Victor Hugo. If only I'd known French then. In English, it was brilliant. In the man's original language, it must have been a stunning book. And some people mock it as romantic literature. But I know this isn't merely romantic. I know that I have seen some of the most hardened, screwed up, and broken people as permanently transformed as Jean Valjean was in that story. And you need to read the story. I'm not going to say any more, except to say that from that day on, he is totally transformed, becomes a mayor of a French town, later on risked his whole life again for somebody that was threatening what he loved most. It's an amazing story. But it's not just romantic, it's accurate. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that changed a wretch like me. We sing that song, we have no meaning, no understanding really of the meaning of it at all. But my friend, the story of Jesus and grace and forgiveness transforming people's lives permanently is a story beautifully expressed in a romantic novel, wonderfully played in recent days in great stage productions. But it's not half as fantastic as the many, many, many times I've seen grace and forgiveness do exactly that in people that I personally know. It's far beyond romanticism. It's reality that God, through this kind of love and care, transforms Les Misérables and makes them people of grace and transformation. Read the book and read the author of Grace. Pick up the Gospels and have a go at them, because that's what moved the bishop to move the criminal to change his life. You and I can pick that up in any language almost in the world today and embrace that transformation ourselves.